Breathing is a rhythmic involuntary act. And so this is going to be controlled by the brainstem, particularly by the medulla oblongata and the pons. So within the medulla, we have the formation of neurons making the rhythmicity center. And so this is what controls our automatic breathing. The phrenic nerve has motor neurons that are going to fire either during inspiration and are termed I neurons, or will fire during expiration and are termed E neurons. The difference between the I and E neurons in terms of what they do is also their location, where the I neurons tend to be more dorsal within the medulla, and the E neurons tend to be more ventral. Now, the pons also affects the medulla. And so what we have are two different areas. So we have the apneustic area, and then we have the pneumotaxic area. All right, so this first one, the apneustic area, this is going to promote inspiration. Okay, and so I'll put a little I right here. Whereas the pneumotaxic center is going to inhibit inspiration. Okay, so this is going to promote then expiration. And so again, these two areas within the pons will affect then the rhythmic pattern of breathing that's set by the medulla. Automatic control of breathing is also influenced by feedback from chemoreceptors, which monitor pH of fluids such as the brain interstitial fluid and the cerebrospinal fluid, and also the pH, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, and the partial pressure of oxygen of blood. And so what we have are two main chemoreceptors, where we have the central chemoreceptors, which are found in the medulla oblongata. And so these are going to be sensitive to changes within that brain interstitial fluid, and within the cerebrospinal fluid, and particularly to carbon dioxide and to hydrogen ions, so low pHs. Whereas the peripheral chemoreceptors will be found in the carotid and aortic bodies, which, just to make sure they're not the same thing as we've covered before, as the carotid and aortic sinuses. And so those monitor blood pressure, whereas now the carotid and aortic bodies will monitor changes in pressures of carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions, okay? And so with the peripheral chemoreceptors, they're involved in controlling breathing indirectly by stimulating the vagus and the glossopharyngeal cranial nerves. And so when we look at this image here, what we have is a flow chart of where we have the peripheral chemoreceptors and then the central chemoreceptors, where they'll be very sensitive to changes, particularly in pH, but also to increased levels of carbon dioxide. All right, so then what they'll do is both stimulate the medulla oblongata to then induce automatic breathing, where typically we'll have an increase in respiration rate and also an increase in tidal volume. And so what that does then is it signals the motor neurons within the respiratory muscles to increase voluntary breathing, and then this continues in a negative feedback fashion until we go back to normal. So the effect of both the central and the peripheral chemoreceptors then is to modify the rate of breathing and also the depth of breathing. All right. So when we have oxygen content that's going to be decreased more slowly because we have a reservoir of oxygen attached to hemoglobin. And so the chemoreceptors then are going to be more sensitive to changes in partial pressure of carbon dioxide rather than partial pressure of oxygen, because in order for those chemoreceptors to be stimulated due to very low levels of oxygen, it would have to be significantly low. These chemoreceptors, though, are also dependent on changes in pH, so looking at a low pH. And so when we look at this equation here, we'll have, if we have an increase in carbon dioxide, then what that means is that that's going to increase the carbonic acid production, which ultimately will increase then the amount of hydrogen ions and thus decreasing that pH. So in situations when we are in hypoventilation, this is when ventilation is inadequate, we'll have carbon dioxide levels rising and then pH falling. And so this is also termed as a condition of hypercapnia, because there will be also an increase in carbon dioxide in the blood. And so we have the shift of this equation going to increase carbon dioxide levels, increasing carbonic acid levels, and thus increasing a release of hydrogen into the blood. Whereas in hyperventilation or rapid breathing, then what we have is a decrease in carbon dioxide levels, and the pH then will start to rise because we're having a decrease in hydrogen ion concentration. So what this does for the blood is that this also decreases carbon dioxide levels in the blood. And so part of it is due to the excessive removal of that carbonic acid. And this takes longer then for the partial pressure of carbon dioxide levels to go back to normal after somebody hyperventilates. So with the central chemoreceptors, these will be sensitive to arterial partial pressure of carbon dioxide, but also sensitive to changes in pH then due to that effect. All right. So if we have an increase in CO2 levels, what happens is that we'll have an increase in carbonic acid levels, and then that will ultimately increase the amount of hydrogen ions, which will decrease then the pH. Okay, and so this is what's going to trigger then those chemoreceptors within that medulla oblongata. All right, and so the response then is to increase ventilation to try and combat that increase in carbon dioxide. And so this is responsible for about 70 to 80% of increased ventilation due to that increase in partial pressure of CO2. Okay, and sorry that I know that's very hard to read, but here we go, CO2. All right, so the response though may take several minutes for this to occur. And so one of the reasons is because hydrogen ions cannot cross the blood-brain barrier, but carbon dioxide can cross it no problem, and then will form that carbonic acid. And so the effect then is to have a decreased pH within then the CSF or cerebral spinal fluid and within the brain interstitial fluid. So the peripheral chemoreceptors are ones that will actually respond more quickly than those central chemoreceptors. And so again, the peripheral chemoreceptors are found in the aortic and carotid bodies, and these will be sensitive to changes within the pH. And this is mostly due to an increase in hydrogen ion concentration that's caused by that increase in carbon dioxide levels. So just like in the last slide with the central chemoreceptors, so an increase in carbon dioxide level still is going to increase the amount of carbonic acid, and this will also increase that hydrogen ion concentration. And so this will be stimulated, these receptors will be, by the changes in the hydrogen ion concentration, but also will have then decreased levels of oxygen because of it. Okay, and so then the stimulus is to breathe in more oxygen and to exhale more carbon dioxide to drive that equation down, so we'll have decreased levels of carbon dioxide, carbonic acid, and then decreased levels of hydrogen ions. So in this flow chart, what we have here is then an example of when we have decreased ventilation, and so this is with hypoventilation, okay? And with hypoventilation then, what we have is an increase in partial pressure of carbon dioxide, which then that's going to increase plasma carbon dioxide levels, but then decreased pH because of the increase in hydrogen ion concentration. Okay, so then if you recall, carbon dioxide can cross the blood-brain barrier, but hydrogen ions can't. And so within the medulla oblongata, what happens is that they're both stimulated, both the chemoreceptors and the respiratory centers, with that increase in carbon dioxide levels. And then also we'll have the peripheral chemoreceptors stimulated. And together then what happens is that the motor neurons are going to stimulate and activate respiratory muscles, and then so we'll have an increase in ventilation. And so this is to take in again more oxygen and get rid of that and exhale that carbon dioxide levels. And so this will continue on until we go back to normal levels in a negative feedback fashion. So the blood partial pressure of oxygen will be affected by breathing indirectly, and this is due to influences of the chemoreceptors that are sensitive to changes in partial pressure of carbon dioxide, which will be driven by low partial pressure levels of oxygen as well. So when we have low oxygen levels, this is going to make the carotid bodies then more sensitive to carbon dioxide within the plasma, and then also to that decreased pH. And so the hypoxic drive, this is when blood partial pressure is constant and the blood partial pressure of oxygen, though, decreases. And so the decrease is from about 100 millimeters of mercury to 70 millimeters of mercury before ventilation is stimulated, okay? And so this will be enhanced by something like emphysema, where emphysema will block the receptor response to partial pressure in carbon dioxide, okay? And so the choroid plexus then will secrete more bicarbonate into the cerebral spinal fluid, which will help to buffer that fall of pH within that cerebral spinal fluid. So it's really then here that abnormally high levels of carbon dioxide are going to stimulate the carotid bodies to the fall in oxygen levels. And so ultimately then, the response is to breathe due to low oxygen levels instead of an increase in carbon dioxide levels.